Hello and welcome to the Stormont Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Stormont and inside policy making for Northern Ireland. I'm Dib McCann, and also on the podcast are our two regulars. We have Tim Kearns, former Special Advisor to First Minister Peter Robinson. Hello, Tim.
Hello, David.
And we have our other regular, Michael McKernan. He was a Special Advisor to the SDLP from 2007 to 2016. Hello, Michael.
Hello, David, and hello, Tim.
Just occurred to me next year is going to be the 10th anniversary, not just of Brexit, but you two leaving the executive. So we'll do the anniversary special on that now.
Oh, he's very peppy this morning, Michael, isn't he? Apparently he's been up from 4 a.m. preparing for this podcast.
I've been up early.
So we must have a special guest.
On the podcast today, we are back looking at the budget. A week on from the second budget of this Labour government, we are discussing the implications for Northern Ireland with the Secretary of State, Hilary Benn, who will be taking our questions about what this budget means locally. And we will also be discussing some other major political issues, such as a border poll and Stormont reform. Then the budget coverage continues. Later in the podcast, we will be joined by Anne Watt from the think tank Pivotal to discuss what's next for the Northern Ireland Executive and where do we need to go with a multi-year budget. All that and more on this edition of Stormont Sources. Now, Rachel Reeves delivered her second budget in the House of Commons. This budget has come under heavy scrutiny about whether there was a need for tax rises and who knew what and when about the fiscal difficulties or not that the UK is in. In Northern Ireland, the executive parties have united to criticise the budget for not giving enough funding to meet local need here. The executive is facing a projected overspend of £400 million, and even with the extra resources announced, it will not come close to bridging that gap. With all these issues swirling around and with some distance from the budget, we thought we would get the Secretary of State, Hilary Benn, to join us to discuss the budget and what it does for families here. And we are delighted to be joined by none other than the Secretary of State, Hilary Benn. Secretary of State, you're very welcome to this edition of Stormont Sources.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Secretary of State, just to talk about, obviously, the Labour government delivered their second budget last week. We're recording on Wednesday, so we're a week out from the second budget. In terms of the impacts for Northern Ireland, I was saying in the intro there, it hasn't been well received by the parties here in Northern Ireland. You know, the main executive party say it doesn't do enough to meet the funding need in Northern Ireland. Obviously, there was Rachel Reeves announced an extra £370 million, which will be spread over a couple of years. I mean, whenever you heard the response from the Northern Ireland parties, what went through your mind whenever you heard criticism after criticism saying it doesn't meet funding need?
Well, because I've been through many, many budgets, I suppose I struggle to think of any budget ever where people have said, oh, well, thank you very much. You've given us exactly what we wanted, whoever it is. My main thought is as follows. Northern Ireland's executive has had an extra £1.7 billion in the last 2 years. It got a record settlement from the spending review in June, the highest ever since devolution began. It is being funded at just above its identified level of need, so 124% of what is provided in England. And Rachel Reeves announced an additional £370 million over the next 4 years in Barnett consequentials. Now, I think the question is, how is that money being spent? Is it being spent as effectively as possible? And if you've got pressures in budgets, all governments have to do this around the world. The first thing you do is ask yourself, well, are we spending the money most effectively? Secondly, public services reform. I mean, one of the consequences, let's be honest, of prolonged periods of Northern Ireland having no government at all, and I've said before, the people of Northern Ireland have been very, very badly served by the absence of government, is that these issues, I think, haven't been grasped in the way that they ought to. And the third element is, well, all governments face choices. And I noted that the weekend before last, John O'Dowd, the finance minister, said to his colleagues, we need to think about some revenue raising. What Rachel Reeves did in the budget was to make choices and to raise some revenue and to identify priorities to spend the money on. And I think the other thing I would say is when you look at the impact on people, in Northern Ireland, the lifting of the two-child benefit cap, that's something the executive asked for, and the government has responded. And that has been very, very widely welcomed. The increase in the minimum wage and the national living wage, which is going to benefit a lot of people in Northern Ireland, the increase in pensions, the offer that the government has made to match the energy bill reduction scheme that we're going to put in place in England with a similar scheme in Northern Ireland. We will talk to the Northern Ireland executive about how they want to design that. When you add that all up, I mean, that was, of course, targeting the cost of living, which is the biggest issue that people raise, and it's as true in Northern Ireland as it is in other parts of the United Kingdom. And I think when you look at that in the round, I think it's a very fair and reasonable budget in difficult circumstances.
But the executive are still facing...
That's what I think when I hear the criticism.
Well, John O'Dowd, you're referencing the finance minister there. He has also noted the £400 million overspend that the executive is facing this year, and obviously the funding settlement that Rachel Reeves delivered last week goes nowhere near to even helping bridge that gap as well. So do you think so from your point of view, from a British government point of view, the overspend will have to be sorted out by the Northern Ireland executive, and that would have to be tackled through either spending cuts or revenue raising? Is that right?
Well, all governments have to live within their means. Northern Ireland's executive is no different to any other government in the world, the UK government, the Welsh government, the Scottish government. No difference. We all have to live within our means. But I'd make this point on public services because, let's take an example. Funding for health is more per head in Northern Ireland than it is in England, more. And yet, if you look at people waiting to see a consultant for the first time, in Northern Ireland, over 50%, when I last looked at the figures, over 50% of people are waiting more than a year. And in England, the figure is about 4%. Question, and it's a perfectly reasonable question for people in Northern Ireland to ask. Hang on a minute, we're getting more funding per head than the health service in England. We're getting 124% overall of what is provided in England, and yet we've got clearly worse outcomes when it comes to waiting to see a consultant. Now, why is that? And that's a perfectly legitimate question for people to ask, and that is why transformation of public services is a very important issue for Northern Ireland. Now, we have been providing some assistance through the Public Services Transformation Fund, as you know, and the first phase of projects were funded last year, and they're good projects. And the Public Services Transformation Board is currently looking at the next phase. So I think the answer to your perfectly fair question is, how is this going to be dealt with? Is you need to look at all of these things in the round and do what all governments have to do.
Yeah. So, but Secretary of State, I think is it fair to say then that obviously because when Labour were elected in July of 2024, there was a bit of hope that a Labour government public spending would be freed up ever so slightly, and that would help the executive meet some of the funding need that they say that they have. But two budgets in, it seems like that money that maybe the Northern Ireland parties are wanting, one, is not forthcoming, and two, just I've noted some of your commentary since you become Secretary of State. I mean, does it frustrate you sometimes that there seems to be a lack of kind of fiscal and policy maturity from politicians who lead the Northern Ireland executive?
Well, I don't agree with your characterisation of what has happened since the Labour government was elected, which is why I said a moment ago, 1.7 billion extra over 2 years, record settlement, funded at need, and £370 million in the budget. And I will continue to come back to that. That is not, some people say, there's been a continuation of Tory austerity. That is absolute nonsense. Nonsense. Nobody can look at what Rachel Reeves has done in the two budgets we've seen thus far and claim in any respect that it's a continuation of Tory austerity. It is not. She's making choices. She has raised taxes, that is true, to fund public services. Why is the two-child benefit cap, which the Northern Ireland executive asked us to get rid of, and many other people, because penalising children for the circumstances of their birth, which means that they and their siblings and their family grow up in poverty, is wrong. Rachel said this is a moral choice. And when it goes to the heart of the question you put, people sometimes say, governments change, but nothing really changes and so on. Well, you can't look at the decision on the two-child benefit cap and say that nothing has changed. A Labour government has come in. We had to solidify the public finances in the first budget because of the complete mess that we were left by the last Conservative government. And being in government is all about making choices, and a Labour government has made the choice to help those families by lifting the two-child benefit cap. Now, that is politics working. And that same process of making choices applies to all governments. There's no escape. You can't say, well, we don't have to do that here because we don't think we've got enough money. The government has provided more money, but there are things that the executive can do for itself in reviewing its own expenditure. Can it spend the money more efficient? It's a perfectly reasonable question to ask in those circumstances. And do we wish to raise more funds? If the executive does want to raise more funds to meet the needs it's identified, well, the means of doing so is in its own hands.
And are you frustrated that they're not asking those questions?
Well, it is for the executive to address the challenge that it has got. But the answer to that can't be to come back to the UK government again and again and say we need more money and we need more money, because we have given more money. And I think it's fair. In 124% constituents in England, they would recognise, yes, Northern Ireland has greater needs, and that's why Northern Ireland gets 124% of what's provided in England. And I think the funding is fair. And don't forget, where did the 124% figure come from? The Northern Ireland Fiscal Council was asked to answer the question, well, what is the level of additional need in Northern Ireland? And it considered and opined and said, yeah, 124%. And that is exactly what the government is doing. We're funding Northern Ireland to its level of need as advised by the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council, and quite rightly so, because of course Northern Ireland has additional needs and the funding recognises that.
I just want to ask a question, if I can, just about things a bit more globally across the piece. So you said that the Chancellor made choices, one of which was the two-child benefit cap. But there's been a lot of criticism for another choice that the Chancellor made this week, and that was not to disclose the more positive forecast that the OBR had given her before she delivered her budget. Now, she wasn't transparent with Parliament. She wasn't transparent with the country. Was she transparent with her cabinet colleagues?
Do you know, I find this row really quite hard to understand. A colleague said to me in the division lobby last night, now let's just get this right. The economic, the financial position of the government turns out to be slightly better than we thought was going to be the case. And people are saying to the Chancellor that she should leave her job because of that. What is going on? The fact is, in the run-up to a budget, and this has been unusual, well, not least because the OBR decided to publish its blue book in advance of the budget actually being delivered. Well, you have to go right back to, I think it was 1947, when Hugh Dalton, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, told a reporter from a London newspaper about a couple of things that were in the budget, not realising that they could get an addition out before he stood up in the House of Commons and he had to go. That's probably the last occasion in which someone lost their job as a result of that. I don't accept the charge that anyone was misled. All budgets, you're weighing stuff up, new information comes in, you decide, am I going to do this? I'm going to do that. And what counts in the end is when the Chancellor of the Exchequer stands up and says, this is what I'm going to do. And people should judge the government on what the budget has done. And I think this is, frankly, an irrelevancy. And in 6 months' time, will people be thinking about the row that has dominated certain newspapers' headlines in the last few days. I don't think they will. They'll be thinking about, well, I've now got higher earnings because I'm on the minimum wage. It's gone up. I'm a pensioner. I've got more money. I'm a family that is benefiting from the lifting of the two-child benefit cap. I'm getting money off my energy bills. That is the real test, I think, for the public, is this helping me? Now, yes, people are having to pay more in tax, and the Chancellor's been really, really open about that in the what she said in the budget and what she said in interviews since. It is about making choices, and I back the choices that Rachel has made 100%.
But I think that the public look at this and they say that the Chancellor was out 4 or 5 days after she had received the information that things were more positive, and she was saying things are bleak, things are dire, things we need to raise taxes. And then she raised taxes to the highest level that they've ever been. And I think this matters because the OECD has looked at this budget and they've said, look, Britain's not going to have economic growth for years now. We're going to have an economy that's stymied. And I suppose people look at this and they say it's about transparency. And I think there's been a number of things in the last year and a half since Labour has come into power where people have questioned transparency. So what would you say to people?
What are you thinking of, Tim? What examples are you thinking of?
Well, I think people look at it and they think, Labour made manifesto pledges in and around energy prices, in and around making the cost of living easier. I think Labour, made pledges in and around immigration that they've been forced into keeping what seems reluctantly rather than doing them willingly. So I think people are looking at this and perception's worth more, I think, than facts. And I think people are perceiving this as a government that's maybe not been as transparent as it possibly could have been. And this is another example of that perception being the case. So what would you say to people who are looking at Labour and thinking, this is not quite what we expected that we were going to get. We expected something different to the Tories. And maybe people are watching and saying, we've just got another example of the Tories. We've got another Chancellor who's come to give a budget that's going to cause economic depression, that's possibly going to crash the economy. How's Labour different to Liz Truss, maybe, is the question people are asking?
There's so much in what you said there that with respect, I don't agree with. First of all, perception matters more than facts. Well, where I come from, facts matter most of all. And the facts are really, really important. Secondly, crash the economy. Blimey. One of the reasons that the inheritance we have had to take on has been so challenging is because it was the previous government that crashed the economy with Liz Truss's absolutely disastrous budget. And the Chancellor was really clear and transparent in the budget last year when she said, we've got this black hole we've got to deal with. We've got to stabilise the public finances. And the government has brought stability. Where do you think 5 interest rate cuts have come from? It's come from having a Labour government that has brought stability. Where do you think 3 trade deals have come from? That last government said, I promise, we leave the European Union, we'll have wonderful trade deals with the United States of America. Well, they certainly didn't deliver one, did they? And we get 3 trade deals agreed by this Labour government, which will benefit Northern Ireland and other parts of the United Kingdom. You look at the role that the Prime Minister has played in, frankly, rescuing Jaguar Land Rover. Because if the Prime Minister hadn't built the relationship he had with President Trump when it came to tariffs, then Jaguar Land Rover would have been in really serious trouble. And that's what you want from your government, do you not? A serious, grown-up government that is tackling the problems that we face. Now, you started your original question quite properly, saying you wanted to talk about the global situation. And these are very, very difficult times. We've got war in Europe. We are supporting Ukraine quite properly. It looks from the news this morning as if the latest efforts at trying to find a peace agreement don't appear to have borne fruit. But no one, honestly, nobody can look at this Labour government and say, It's a continuation of what we had before. I simply don't accept that.
Well, I mean, I get that you don't accept that, but
Yeah.
I think here's the fundamental question. Like, why is this not cutting through? You have this massive majority. You can do whatever you want. You've got, you can push through whatever policies you want to push through. You do not need any help, any support. You can even have a 100 MPs rebelling, and the Prime Minister can deliver his agenda. So given the massive majority you have, given the massive, the massive goodwill that came on the 4th of July last year, why is this just not cutting through? You say facts are important, and of course that's right, but the perception is that this Prime Minister is not delivering. This perception is this Chancellor is crashing the economy. Now, I don't accept that you think that's right, but that's the perception that people feel. Why can people not feel that it's different under Labour, and how are you going to change that?
Well, the OBR's forecast that we're going to grow by 1.5% this year. I don't see how that squares with the charge that this government is crashing the economy. I'm sorry. I mean, we're talking about.
Well, the OECD, says that growth is going to be stymied. After this year, it's going to be stymied for 3 or 4 years.
Absolutely a challenge. And on the growth front, Northern Ireland is doing quite well. Northern Ireland has so much potential, not least because of the dual market access that the Windsor Framework has given it. But of course, growth is a challenge. So what is one thing that the government has done? Now, it applies in England, doesn't apply in Northern Ireland because planning law is, of course, a Northern Ireland executive responsibility. We've put in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which is to try and enable more economic development to take place. And I read something the other day that said that bill could be the most important contribution to supporting economic growth for the UK economy of anything that the government has done. Now, the legislation, I think, is just about gone through. It's going to take time to come into effect and for people to see the change. Look, I think there's a general observation I can make. Governing is hard. Expectations are high. And sometimes you just have to get your head down and say, we're going to carry on doing what we promised. And the tests are very clear, getting the economy to grow, tackling migration. We have seen, as it turns out, a big fall in net migration. The Home Secretary has put out her proposals to try and address that. We're going to build more homes and we're going to get waiting lists down. And in England, of course, there's been a significant reduction in the waiting list, many more appointments. We said we'd do 2 million in the first year. I think we've done nearly 5 million more appointments in the first year. Now, that is the hard graft of government, taking the decisions, putting in the investment, which the Chancellor has raised through her 2 budgets, to try and improve things for people. And the test will be not what the opinion polls say today. The test will be when the next election happens and people will make their choice. That's a democracy.
Well, the only thing I would and I'll finish with this, and then Michael's got a few questions. So why will people only be 0.3% better off after this budget? And that's astonishingly low in the history of Britain. So people are just not feeling it. They're just not feeling it in their pocket. So are you saying we just have to wait and see, and you will feel it in a year or 2 years' time? I have to say, I don't know this Prime Minister and this Chancellor has that length of time.
Well, look, you have to take a historical view of this because we had the great crash in 2008 and we had COVID. So there's been a long period, indeed the period of government where living standards did worst was the period of the last government. So this is a long-standing concern. And that's why people are frustrated. I completely get why people are frustrated because there's been a long period in which their living standards haven't improved. And that has made things tough. But the best way forward is to get more economic growth. And that's why, for example, one of the deals that we have reached is with the European Union, highly relevant to Northern Ireland, because we now know the damage that Brexit has done to the economy. That is quite clear. The OBR has spelled that out. The Chancellor, the Prime Minister have talked about it. And when you think about it, well, it's not surprising, because if you make trade with your biggest, nearest and most important trading partner more difficult, well, what do you expect? And the untruths that we're told, there are no downsides, only upsides. Look at what has happened to parts of our trade with the European Union. So the deal that we agreed with the EU in May, and the SPS agreement, is really important to many businesses in the agri-food and plant sector in Northern Ireland, because when we get that, and we're working hard to negotiate it, this will ease quite a number in that sector of the economy of the concerns that people in GB and Northern Ireland talk about when it comes to the movement of food and food products and animals and plants between GB and Northern Ireland. Now, that is a government which has understood what the problem is and is taking steps and has been able to negotiate an agreement with the EU that will lead to them being eased. And I tell you, when the agreement with the EU was reached I think it was in May, there was a universal welcome in Northern Ireland, which is quite rare, a universal welcome for the prospect of an SPS deal, was there not?
Well, you've just asked the question, do we not all welcome an SPS deal? David, you can answer that.
Absolutely, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's bipartisan support. I mean, look, and obviously in terms of resolving some of the difficulties around the Windsor framework, obviously there's broad bipartisan agreement, which is rare in Northern Ireland, actually. So I suppose well done to you for being able to unite the parties on that. But Michael, I know you're one of your big things that you've talked about on the podcast is Stormont reform. So away you go.
Secretary of State, welcome to Stormont Sources. I'm glad you mentioned Brexit, because I was going to mention it, because it has absolutely choked growth on the UK economy, almost death by 1,000 cuts. There's no doubt the people of Northern Ireland will welcome the lifting of the two-child limit on benefits, and that will benefit people here disproportionately in Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the UK. And it's good that there's a better budget outlook. Even if the Chancellor kept some of it under her hat, it's still good to know. Just on the question of reform, we've had the political parties here talk about the difficulty of the mandatory coalition and the current arrangements in government, and you have in particular the Alliance Party and the leader of the opposition, Matthew O'Toole, calling for a sit-down on institutional reform or reform of the arrangements for devolution. Can I just ask you, have you any particular preferences in that whole area of institutional reform, and have you had any initial discussions with the parties on specific proposals for reform?
Well, the first thing I would say is that mandatory coalition is very difficult, especially being in coalition with another party that has a very, very different view to yours about the constitutional future of Northern Ireland. But that was the remarkable thing about the Good Friday Agreement, was people were prepared to come together to bring an end to the conflict and replace it with politics. Now, as I said earlier, there have been long periods where government has not functioned. And the truth about the power sharing arrangement that was founded by the Good Friday Agreement is it also contains the seeds of its own downfall, because one party walks out and the institutions collapse. And there is, my view is very clear, we can't have a return to collapse. We simply can't. And since the executive returned, it's difficult, but I've been encouraged by the way in which the parties have sought to work together. My view on reform is very simple. If there is an agreement between all of the parties about the nature of reform, then I'm up for a conversation. But just in the way that the Good Friday Agreement had to come about by means of an agreement, the same would be true of reform of the institutions. So really the onus is on the parties, And if they can reach agreement, these are changes that we would like to make, then, as I said, I would, of course, be up for the conversation. But without agreement, it's hard to see how you take that forward.
But you're not.
In the meantime, there's a hugely important job of getting on with.
Yeah, but you're not trying to drive that process. You're waiting for them to come up with something first and bring it to you,
I think,
as opposed to you saying, well, here's a good idea. For example, you could get rid of First and Deputy First Minister and have joint First Ministers, might be helpful. You could rejig the designation system, which really irritates the Alliance Party when they get a big vote and a big number of seats. But you're not going to them, you're waiting for them to come to you.
Well, I think the lead has to come from the parties, because it was the parties who enabled the Good Friday Agreement to happen, and it was a huge achievement. I mean, whether we got the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister in effect, that they have the same power within the system, and if one were giving out titles in the past, people might have done it differently. But anyway, look, we are where we are. I think the number one priority is to be getting on with the job of governing. There are big challenges that we've been discussing on this podcast, and that should be the priority. But there are voices calling for reform, and I get that. I understand that. I hear it, and I do talk to people about it from time to time. But there would need to be agreement, because you can't, I'm quite clear, you can't impose an agreement on unwilling parties, because I don't think that is going to work.
Okay. As you alluded to earlier, the biggest single reform would be constitutional change. And you have kind of put that to bed when you said that a border poll is, quote, many years off. So it's time to concentrate on the here and now. And you've said that very clearly. But yet the voices calling for a border poll haven't gone away. And even those who aren't calling for a border poll are saying, Secretary of State, publish the criteria that would apply in the instance of a border poll. I would suggest to you that those criteria don't even exist yet. Also, people are saying, well, if not the criteria, can you publish some kind of indicative timeline? Even this past couple of weeks, the leader of your sister party in the Republic, the leader of the Irish Labour Party, has called for the publication of a timeline. But can you confirm that there's no document in your possession that sets out the criteria or the timeline for a border poll? And if not, have you commissioned any work on this or seen any work done by officials on this whole subject?
Well, I have one document in my possession relating to a border poll, and that is the Good Friday Agreement, which I've read extremely carefully. And the answer to your second question, there is one criterion. There are not criteria, there is one criterion. And what the Good Friday Agreement says, that if, in the view of the Secretary of State, that in the event of a poll, a majority of people in Northern Ireland would vote for constitutional change, then he or she shall hold one. And that is a judgment. I mean, those who drafted the Good Friday Agreement weighed every single word with enormous care. And that was the result. And therefore, when people say there must be a border poll by a certain date, my response is, well, I'm afraid that is not consistent with the Good Friday Agreement, is it? The Good Friday Agreement doesn't say it must be held by X date or Y date. It doesn't say that. It is a condition. It's the Secretary of State's judgment of what the likely outcome is. And if and when and as that moment arrives, and I am of the view that it's a long way off, because no one who is calling for a border poll can actually argue that that condition is currently met in Northern Ireland. There's nothing one can point to that says the majority of people in Northern Ireland are in favour of constitutional change, which is why I and others have said that is certainly some years off. So I think we have a clear condition. I'm sure the Secretary of State at the time, whoever it is, will know what his or her responsibility is if and when that moment comes. For now, There's so much to be getting on with to make Northern Ireland the best place for the people of Northern Ireland. And that is the responsibility that falls on all of us, me and my job and the executive and the MLAs and councillors and all the people I have the privilege of working with who want the best for Northern Ireland. We've just got to make sure we take the right decisions.
I have to say, Secretary of State, we're in 100% agreement. I keep telling these two, they're not going to get their border poll. We need to make Northern Ireland work.
Tim, I agree with the Secretary of State there is a single criterion in the Good Friday Agreement, and it is when the Secretary of State considers that a majority would vote for a constitutional change. But I suppose what people are asking is what sort of things are going through the Secretary of State's head when he addresses that single criterion. Is he talking about a run of opinion polls? Is he talking about election results? I mean, if there was a nationalist majority in the next Assembly election, would that be an indication that a border poll couldn't be far away? Or so on. I think people are entitled, and even all our senior journalists are all publishing books at a rate of knots on this very subject. I think it would be good if the Secretary of State could say just a little more specifically what type of things would be in his mind when he addresses that single criterion.
Well, I would answer by saying, as I said a moment ago, there is no evidence at all that criterion has been met currently. And I suppose that the fair questions that you raise are ones to put to my successors.
Okay, so it's not
ruled out until the end of this.
I may be in this job a short or a long time. That is entirely in the hands of the Prime Minister.
I think we'll all be long dead, all four of us, before there's ever any border poll.
Secretary of State, you've had a long and distinguished career, but there's no reason to think why you wouldn't be in the next government introducing a border poll.
So Secretary of State, you've been very generous with your time, but just one last question I have for you is just actually on the basis of the next election. There has been a bit of talk here recently about the next Assembly election date, about the potential of it being moved because it coincides with the local government election result in 2027. Do you have any plans that you want to elaborate us with? Will we be going to the polls on May the 6th, 2027? Is there any plans so far to move the date of either the local government or the Assembly election so far?
No. That's a very easy question. The answer is no.
No, brilliant. That makes my job so much.
You can't. Now, is that transparent enough for you?
That is very transparent. We're all going to the polls then on May the 6th, 2027.
That's what we love. Politicians who give transparent and clear answers. Thank you, Secretary of State.
Well, there we are. Well, it's been a joy talking to you. Can I wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year? And maybe at some time in the future I might appear on your wonderful programme again.
You'd be very welcome.
Thank you, Secretary of State, for joining us. Lots more to come from Tim and Michael. We'll be chatting with Anne Watt from the think tank Pivotal after this about more implications of the most recent budget on Northern Ireland and where we need to go with a potential multi-year budget. Just remember, if you'd like to watch the podcast, head to YouTube, search for Stormont Sources, press subscribe to the channel where you can get our latest episodes, watch our clips and leave your comments on X and TikTok and be the first to hear about upcoming events and special episodes. Make sure you subscribe to our mailing list at stormontsources.com. This is the Stormont Sources podcast. Now, we were hearing from the Secretary of State earlier in the pod, but we want to take the conversation a little bit deeper as we continue with our analysis of Budget 2025. And we thought, who better to get on next to the Secretary of State, but Anne Watt from the think tank Pivotal. Obviously, there are challenges ahead for Northern Ireland as John O'Dowd attempts to put together a multi-year budget. We haven't had one of those in well over a decade. And obviously there is the projected £400 million overspend. And of course, the funding announcements from the government, despite what the Secretary of State says, do not come close to helping the executive bridge that £400 million overspend. So we're delighted to be joined by Anne Watt from the think tank Pivotal. And you're very welcome to Stormont Sources.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate the invitation. Glad to be with you today.
And just before, because Pivotal has been around for a bit, right? So just if we can take 45 seconds or so, could you just tell us a little bit about Pivotal, your work that you do and the analysis you conduct?
Yeah, so Pivotal is an independent think tank. So we're here to help contribute to better policy making in Northern Ireland, and we're doing that from outside of politics and outside of government. So there's no alignment to any political party or to any political ideology, and also, really importantly, we're operating outside of governments as well. So we're trying to do useful analysis. We publish research reports on more detailed issues, like we've done work about integration in schools, about why so many young people leave Northern Ireland, about economic inactivity. And then we also do quite regular tracker reports, looking at what the executive has done and whether it's achieving its objectives and whether it's doing what it needs to do to address the many challenges we have here.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's us in a nutshell. People can find out more on our website, pivotalpolicy.org.
Right. Well, look, again, it's much needed. And look, whether you agree or disagree with some of the findings of your work, we need more of that kind of policy analysis. So we're delighted to have you here today. So let's get into some policy analysis. The budget, obviously, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, we actually were tripped up because we were responding pretty quickly to the budget last week. When we heard £370 million, we thought that could be potentially used in 1 year to meet most of the overspend. But it's not actually. It's over a number of years, and it does at most tinkering around the edges. The funding settlement for Northern Ireland, obviously the Secretary of State is talking about the record funding settlement that we've had. Your thoughts on where Northern Ireland's fiscal stance is after this budget?
Yeah, so I also heard the 370 million figure in the Chancellor's speech, and I thought, oh, that's very like 400 million. But then I thought, no, that's not what we're looking at, is it? And I got the breakdown of the numbers later, and actually it's only 19 million extra in this financial year. So that doesn't go very far at all to address the shortfall. So really the pressure's still on all the departments, and with the Department of Finance trying to pull it all together, the pressure's still on departments to get that overspend down as much as they can this year. But, at this stage, that's very, very difficult because we're into December. Funding is committed. There are statutory obligations, obviously, right across the board in terms of what the departments have to do. So you can't cut funding very easily at this stage. I know they are doing things like recruitment freezes and reducing temporary staff and postponing projects, but it'll be difficult, really difficult to get down below around 400 million, I think. So they're putting in the effort, but yeah, very hard. And I suppose I'd say, why are we in this situation again? We know that we have to pay increases every year, particularly. So why are we not budgeting properly from the start of the year? Yeah. We've had repeated financial crisis, one after another, in recent years, and we still seem to be caught out mid-year with pay disputes and needing to make pay awards. So there's definitely some big improvement needed there in terms of budgeting for all costs at the start of the year.
Something just picking up on that. The Secretary of State, when we had him on just before the break, he was pointing out that we have more spend on health per head of population compared to the rest of the UK. Why are we so bad at spending money? What is it? Is it because we're small? Is it economies of scale? Is it just bad government? Or why are we so bad at spending money when England's getting much better outcomes on much less money, as is Scotland and Wales?
Yeah, and I think that's the big challenge for us here. I think in the first instance, you've got to say we've got higher need here, haven't we? We've got lower incomes, worse health, more dispersed population, probably a younger population. So we've got higher need, but that should all be reflected in the extra funding that we do get because of that higher need. And there's been all the work recently on the needs assessment, and maybe we can talk about that. But I think I'd say several things in response to that. So yeah, higher need to start with, but then also we haven't transformed our health service in the way that we should have done. So this is a conversation that's been had lots of times, and you've talked about it on the podcast, and other people have talked about it. But we haven't implemented the recommendations in Bengoa about reconfiguring health, about putting much more emphasis on prevention, about putting much more into primary care than in secondary care. So really, we're long overdue making those changes, and making the cost savings that would come along with that. So yeah, so that's the big thing I would point to, and I think there's loads that we need to learn from. There's loads that we need to learn from other places which are just doing things better, the comparative reports that look at how much does a particular procedure cost or how much does a particular course of drugs cost here compared to elsewhere. And we need to, all of those things, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to make those better, I think.
Michael, you want to
What happens then if we don't close the 400 million gap? And I think that very unlikely, not just for the reasons you gave, but also because ministers in this arrangement will be looking at each other and say, well, he can make the savings or she can make the savings. I'm not going to do it. Or the ministers in my party aren't going to do it. Let the other party do it. And I think we're going to reach the year end probably not only with the 400, but that doesn't even include the claim for the IT disaster with the police. So it could be even more. What happens then? The money comes out of next year's block?
Well, that's what the rules say, and I agree with you, Michael. I can't see how the executive will be able to get the overspend down to, much less than 400, particularly if you include that 119 million on the PSNI data breach thing. So so it comes out of next year's block. That's the rules with the Treasury. So there's an agreement between the Treasury and all the devolved administrations about how their funding works. And within that, it basically says if you overspend, then you get deducted next year, which is obviously it's a pretty harsh sanction. But then the Treasury would say, well, otherwise you'd be just spending as much as you want. So they have to put in tough rules. And look, if that happens, that is really bad news for us here. By the way, I think it will happen. I can't see the UK government, just saying, "Oh, that's all right. You don't need to worry about that." I think if there's an overspend, it will be deducted from next year. And the real problem is, if you look at the numbers for next year, it's basically not much more than flat cash. So there's not much increase at all in the budget for Northern Ireland for next year compared to this year, which is very concerning situation. And I know this is obviously creating a lot of worry and a lot of work at the minute within the Department of Finance and across the executive departments.
There'll be another round.
How are they going to manage with that?
Another round of compounded public sector pay increases next year. So there's pressures we haven't even seen yet.
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, So so the way I would put it is say your budget is flat in cash terms, and then you're trying to pay say, I don't know, 3.5% pay rise, which wouldn't be, that wouldn't be an unreasonable pay rise for people to be expecting. How on earth are you going to do that when 60% of the executive spending is pay? If you've got a flat cash budget, you're trying to pay 3.5% out of, for 60% of that budget. It doesn't add up. So it's an enormous problem coming down the line.
And all this is coming like next year. I'm talking about because we're basically at the end of 25 now. I mean, 2027 is an election year as well. So this time next year, when the executive is putting all of this together for the January budget, that's going to be a hell of a thing for the main executive party, the DP and Sinn Féin in particular. Just 5 months out from an election, that's going to be just in terms of the politics of that. I mean, is there a danger? Because you remember whenever the ministers, before they got kicked out of office in 2022, they signed off all this uncosted spending, and there were all these projected millions that they ran over budget. Is there a danger that potentially happens again? That you may get a minister going, well, I may not be appointed to this department again, so yeah, I'll just sign that off there. Is there a risk of that again, or because we have a functioning executive now that's unlikely to happen?
I suppose that shouldn't happen. I suppose it could happen. The other thing I'd say, just in what you said at the start there, David, is that this time next year they should actually be operating on their multi-year budget. So they're supposed to be agreeing a multi-year budget. It's meant to be coming out for consultation before Christmas. I think that might be a tall order, so we'll see if that happens. But they should be on, looking at year 2 of their multi-year budget at that stage. So yeah, I mean, I suppose ministers can make commitments to spend, and then the election happens, and whether that spending actually goes ahead afterwards is another matter, because a new minister could come in, new executive, new finance minister could say, no, that's not happening. So I think there is that risk. I think the thing we need to remember as well, looking at the last few years, is if you track back, you can see how all these budgetary crisis that we've had in the last number of years have been resolved by a big injection of money from the UK government, one way or the other. So if you look at this time last year, so we were talking about that 19 million this year in the budget. Last year in the budget, there was 640 million, right, from the UK government, because it was the new Labour government. They'd come in, first budget, big changes, lots of unpopular things, but it did result in big Barnett consequentials. So the executive got 640 million slightly out of the blue last October, and that solved their overspend. The previous financial year, if you go back to February 2024, they were also looking at a massive overspend, and they got a big injection of cash in the restoration package. So really, we've had overspend after overspend, which has been solved by not entirely, certainly by the executive's efforts across departments, but actually by big new injections of money. And I just don't see that coming, as the Secretary of State's been really clear, hasn't he? You know, you've had your money, you've got your spending review settlement. There's no more coming. And I think, the UK government have had that spending review. That's a seriously big piece of work looking forward 3 years, setting allocations for all departments. They're not going to start unpicking it now. And also as part of that, they've had all their discussions with Northern Ireland about the level of need, and they've changed the Barnett formula to give that new uplift to reflect need. So again, I can't see them backtracking on that and suddenly coming up with something which is going to resolve the gaps that the executive has.
But if there's this funding shortfall of 500 million, and the Secretary of State says you're going to have to raise your own cash, I wonder, how on earth do we raise half a billion quid? Because a 1% rise in the regional rate gets you about 10 million quid. Moving the cutoff from 400,000 to 500,000 for rates in general raises about 2 million quid. So how do we get from a 1% rise in rates being 10 million quid to 500 million? I mean, I just don't see how the answer can be just raise the revenue yourself. But that's what the Secretary of State keeps saying. So do you have any thoughts on how we can do that?
The answer can't possibly just be revenue raising for exactly that reason. So only 5% or thereabouts of the executive budget comes through the rates. And as you said, I think the figure that I hear Neil Gibson saying, who's the Permanent Secretary in the Department of Finance, he says, if you put the rates up 6%, you get 100 million, right? So 6% would be higher than what most people are expecting. And I expect that would be, might be just about tolerated, but not much higher than that. So you put the rates up 6%, you get 100 million. So the answer is it can't be entirely revenue raising. I don't think, certainly not in the short term. You could, I suppose, look at legislative change and start doing water charges, which would bring in 300 to 400 million. I think the answer, Tim, is it's a combination of things. It's a combination of looking at what are you spending on, as well as thinking, can you raise more money? So it has to be taking a more fundamental look at spending and whether your spending is as effective as it can be, whether there's different ways to do things. And I think this is really unpopular. Well, revenue raising is really unpopular, but another thing that's really unpopular is starting to ask questions about public sector pay parity, because that is a huge part of the pressures on the executive's budget. So is there something that needs to happen on pay parity that is maybe that only lower paid staff get pay parity or something like that? Or because the reality is, if you keep maintaining pay parity and you haven't got the money to pay for it, then the only answer is, if you want to maintain pay parity, you'll have to have fewer staff, actually, so the overall bill isn't as high. And I mean, that then has an impact on services. So I think the answer, the answer is not easy. It is not easy, and I don't have the answer at all. But the answer is some combination of things.
There's no answer in the current year. I mean, the current year is nearly gone. And I can. John O'Dowd has already ruled out water charges during the lifetime of this government. So there's no big chunky revenue reason. The only thing that has changed from the terrible outlook of a few weeks ago is that Rachel Reeves now has more headroom. before the budget, she could have said, sorry, guys, no money, haven't got any. No means no. Now, no mightn't mean no. If we go back and say, well, you give yourself some headroom precisely to deal with a financial crisis such as ours. So open the checkbook, Chancellor.
And you were saying there, Anne, that there's the just what Michael was saying there, that obviously that's incredibly unlikely. But we've seemed to have latched on really to the idea of a multi-year budget. And the idea, I mean, we were talking about this last week on the podcast, and Tim and Michael were in an executive that actually did have a multi-year budget. But, John O'Dowd kind of was not that he's opposed to it, he's in favour of it, but he was kind of tempering, I think, in the Assembly the other week, some expectations about it, that almost a bit like, let's lower corporation tax and that'll boost the economy, that it wouldn't be a silver bullet for the financial challenge. Could you walk us through, from your analysis, what the kind of positives of a multi-year budget are, but also maybe some of the difficult decisions that still need to be faced with one?
I suppose a multi-year budget is one of those things where it's just definitely good practice, and everybody thinks, yes, we should be doing that because it enables more longer term planning. So you can think in much more detail about how you're delivering public services, how you're going to change them, what reforms you're going to do, how you plan in your workforce particularly, and that's something which we've, I think, not done very well in recent years in public services. Also thinking about investment, so it just gives you a more stable platform to work off, and also if it's passed on to organisations both in the public and the voluntary and community sector who are funded out of a multi-year budget, if they also get a 2 or 3 year settlement, that's good for them as well, because then they know what their budget is and they can employ staff and make better plans. So it's one of those things which is just accepted as good practice, and I definitely agree with that. The thing is, it doesn't give you any more money. You can look, when you look at the numbers, whether you do a singular budget or a multi-year budget, you've still got the same amount of money. It should mean it's better budgetary management, but it's certainly not, and I don't know if this is what the finance minister was implying, it's certainly not going to, suddenly produce an increase in funding that we don't have at the minute. So it's definitely a good thing, but you're still looking at the same amount of money. And I think the difficulty the executive's facing, and this is what I'm sure is going on within the Department of Finance and across departments at the minute, is when you see the numbers for the next few years in black and white, and you see this basically not much more than flat in cash terms budget, it's going to be terrifying. It's because because the implications of it are so severe. So whether you've got a single year budget or a multi-year budget, the difficulties are the same. How you're gonna manage within that, and so maybe the finance minister is trying to temper expectations about, everybody thinks we're going to be heading into some happy place where we have a multi-year budget that solves all our problems, but that's not going to be the case.
Okay.
Yeah,
Michael,
will Pivotal be producing any advice for our political leaders on this, because they? We'll be pretty sure they need some advice on what to do in the future.
Yeah, so we're working on a report at the minute, which is hopefully coming out early next week, on exactly the issues we've been talking about. So we've had a good look at the numbers from the past few years and looked ahead to what's coming up in terms of what budget is available in the coming years, and thought about what are the big learning points really for the executive here, and how can they make the best of this opportunity? And I suppose there's lots of things in that, and I'm not going to spill all the beans on the podcast, and I encourage people to watch out for my report, and maybe you can have a read, and maybe I can come back.
No scoop for Stormont Sources
no scoop.
Today.
I suppose the first thing I'd say is, I think it's really important the executive does actually set a multi-year budget, because, to be honest, given the numbers, it would be tempting not to, and also given the election, not so far away, they might say, oh, we'll just do a single year budget, and I think that would be really disappointing if that happened. So I think the first thing is they need to seize the opportunity that's presented to them now that they do have a 3-year settlement from the UK government. The other thing, and I said this a bit earlier, they really need to set sensible budgets at the start of the year, and take into account all the costs, including pay costs, because it does seem we've got into a pattern of not doing that and setting inadequate budgets and then having a crisis. And then I think we're into all sorts of really fundamental questions about using this opportunity to think more long term and more strategically about everything that the executive is spending on. So the executive tends to do its budgeting by adding on a bit onto whatever the department got last year. So they look at how much extra they've got overall, how much has come through the Barnett formula, and then they divide it up between the departments. And so everybody gets what they got last year plus a little bit more. And that then, if you do that, you're not asking more fundamental questions about everything in the budget. And so I think they should be really doing a bit more of an examination of how they're spending all the money. Why are we delivering public services in the way that we are? Where are we delivering them? How are we delivering them? Should some of those things be different? Other places that we could learn from who are doing things better? So asking more, more kind of zero-based budgeting type questions about all of spending. So I think there's a really interesting sort of tension or contradiction when you think about spending in Northern Ireland, because lots of people will say there's no money anywhere. There's nothing more we can save. We're pared back. There's no more fat to be trimmed. We can't do anything. And then there's the absolute opposite view, which a lot of people have, which is there's endless waste in the public sector and we need to do things differently. And the truth's somewhere in the middle of those two things. And my take on that is with the systems we have, we've pared back a lot in the last few years, and we've really reduced things back. But actually, some of the systems really need to change. So we need to be delivering public services in a different way and asking those more fundamental questions about, how and where and why we're delivering particular services in the way that we are. And this all comes back to transformation, really, because that's, I suppose, one way to describe transformation in more day-to-day terms. It's asking those big basic questions of how and why and where are we delivering public services. Early intervention is a really big principle, I think, that we should be thinking about more. We should be doing much more to prevent problems before they escalate. And we've got into a situation, I think, across public services where we're just dealing with the crisis when it emerges, whether that's an illness issue or a young person dropping out of school or an addiction issue or offending behaviour. Early intervention and prevention is a much better way to approach all these problems, and we need to embed that more.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, thank you for coming on and for chatting to us just about putting that in that context about, where we need to go and what the current budget actually does. And so, from Pivotal Think Tank, we'll be keeping an eye on your research, which is set to be published next week. So we'll be taking a look at that as well. So, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Tim and Michael. And thanks for inviting me on, and well done on the podcast. It's a great listen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Well, that was a very busy podcast. We told you last week we would do a deep dive on the budget, and hopefully we delivered. I think that's...
We can't leave it there. That's been a depressing end where our budgets are bust. We need something positive in the run-up to Christmas, David.
Well,
what's one thing to be positive about? Michael, you're the Mr. Positivity.
What's there? Oh, you've put me on the spot.
Even Michael.
I suppose Celtic have closed the gap completely on Hearts, so we can look forward to a hoopy Christmas.
And Glentoran in the semi-final of the League Cup, and Manchester United are chasing Chelsea down in the league. So producer Paul, I think, is gonna look like he's got egg on his face at the end of the season. That's reasons to be positive. David, finish us off. Give us something positive.
Well, here's positive that we're having the locals and the assembly on the same day in 2027, so that we can.
That's not positive, because if they were split, you would double up your pay.
Not
so
just
you would on the BBC.
The counts are on different days. So by the way, for every political commentator now, you can keep your Friday, your Saturday, and the Monday and Tuesday. Book those off now in 2027 in May, because you'll be busy. Look, that was a busy podcast, but hopefully again, budgetary analysis that for Northern Ireland that you won't get anywhere else. So look, we're delighted to have our thanks to the Secretary of State and our thanks to Watt for being so generous with their time and helping us unpack that. And also a big thank you to my other two regulars, Michael and Tim, for going around the houses with me. But main thank yous to you, our listeners, for joining us on the Stormont Sources podcast. If you want to engage with anything you've heard, drop us a WhatsApp with your questions or comments, 0333 404 6507. Remember to use the word Stormont, so we know it's for this podcast. You can also drop us an email, hello@stormontsources.com. We read it all. That's all we have time for this edition of Stormont Sources. We'll be back again next week.